At the end of the 19th century, Canada became known worldwide as the land of hope and promise. This country attracted many citizens from abroad, including Francis Mawson Rattenbury of Leeds in England. Rattenbury, called Rats by his friends, was born on October the 11th, 1867, and at the age of 20 he joined his uncle's architectural firm, Lockwood and Mawson, in Bradford, England. He articled there for 5 years, gaining experience in commercial and civic design, structural systems, architectural history, vocabulary and practice. But he craved more than the staid future could offer him in the family firm. In 1892, at age 25, Rattenbury found himself in Vancouver, in British Columbia, Canada. His timing was extremely lucky, for in the July 5th, 1892 issue of the World newspaper was a notice to architects advertising a design competition for a new legislature building in Victoria to replace the 1860 drafty, leaky Legislative Hall, a wooden building known colloquially as the birdcages because of their shape. Rattenbury's application, with the pseudonym a BC architect, was filed along with 66 others. A falsified work history record, along with Rattenbury's prize-winning claims as a draftsman, accompanied a remarkable set of designs, and he won the prestigious 1893 contract. Despite many problems, including exceeding the original $500,000 budget by almost double, a staggering miscalculation of budgets in the 1890s, the British Columbia Parliament buildings began operation officially in 1898. The murals were commissioned to artist George Southwell in 1932 in the Rotunda, which depicts scenes of British Columbia's history from 1792 to 1843. Decades later, controversy arose over the depiction of West Coast Aboriginal people in the murals, which in modern times is now regarded as degrading. One mural, entitled Labour, portrays a bare-breasted Aboriginal woman hauling timber while a white man watches. Rattenbury was sometimes thought of as an ill-tempered and mean man who was extremely frugal with his money, yet a brilliant architect, becoming the toast of the province among the elite class, and he had an ever-widening circle of clients, patrons and admirers. He was a handsome, wealthy bachelor and an intriguing lure to marriage-minded Victorian débutantes, the attractive educated daughters of powerful men. But, for some reason, he didn't feel that any of them were marriageable. While supervising the building of the legislature, he often frequented Eleanor Howard's boarding house to meet with the Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works. It was here that he met Florence Eleanor Nunn, the daughter of George Elphinstone Nunn. Nunn, a retired British Army officer who was also drawn into the gold rush on the Fraser River, returned to Victoria from time to time, fathering more children, Florrie being one of them. Nunn then returned no more and totally disappeared. Florrie was considered by some homely and short, with a prominent nose, a square jaw, and large frog-like eyes. What she lacked in captivating physical charms, however, she made up for by being thought very kind and gentle. Rattenbury was captivated by her quiet, servile manner, saying to friends that she brought alive the memories of his mother. In 1896, Rattenbury had earned $41,000 in commission from the legislature building project, a huge sum, and was itching to do something with it. He smelled opportunity in the fever of the Klondike gold rush and invested wisely in it. He worked tirelessly to acquire steamers for the Rennet Lake and Klondike Navigation Company, and in 1898, Rattenbury was ready to launch his first steamer service to Klondike. It was then that he proposed marriage to Florrie Nunn, aged 31 and practically an old maid by the standards of the time. She happily accepted. Some people in the elite classes of Victoria had snidely remarked that her maiden name, Nunn, was appropriate for her demeanour. Ambitious men like Rattenbury usually married society women who would aid in furthering their husbands' careers. Again, Rattenbury had his own way of thinking. So, on June the 18th, 1898, he stunned Victoria's society by marrying Florence Eleanor Nunn, the adopted daughter of the boarding house keeper, in a quiet ceremony attended by a handful of friends, not many, and various other hangers-on. The wedding was perhaps a bit out of the ordinary for Rattenbury and his lifestyle, but the honeymoon was not. Rattenbury combined it with a business trip to Alaska. Their son, Francis Rattenbury, was born the same year, 7 months following the wedding, which led people to believe that Florrie's wedding may have been of the shotgun variety. Rattenbury Jr. was born with club feet, so badly deformed that it was thought that Snooker, or Snooky as he was nicknamed, would never walk. Mr. and Mrs. Rattenbury had 2 children, the second child a daughter, Mary, born in 1904. Discouraged with free enterprise in Alaska, Rattenbury returned to Victoria in 1899 and built the family home, Ayachineal, in Oak Bay, a suburb of Victoria, where native legend has it that man was given first speech and literally translated to the place where good things happened. The home was compact and practical, like an English cottage, departing from Rats's own usual grandiose style. Florrie never fitted into the high society of Victoria and was always looked upon as the adopted daughter of a boarding house keeper with a brother who made his living as a waiter. Society continued to be surprised at Rattenbury's choice of a bride for a long time, seeing it as a total mismatch. In time, the mismatch became more obvious. Rattenbury returned to architecture, and when he went out socializing, he went alone. Florence pottered around the house and gardens, rarely entertained, grew increasingly stout, prim, and dull. The gulf between them widened. Hostility developed into outright animosity. Rattenbury and Florence did not get along and fought often when he was at home, and by the onset of World War I, they were no longer speaking to each other. Unfortunately for one so talented in architecture and business, he failed miserably in his personal life, for by 1923 the marriage was a shambles. They lived in the same house, but no longer spoke to one another, depending on their daughter Mary to carry messages between them. Up to this point, Rattenbury had had a 2-decades-long string of business successes, including shipping, land speculation, and great architectural successes. His commercial ventures were complicated and spectacular, with only a few failures. Rattenbury's contribution to BC architecture was not in the originality of his designs, but rather in his ability to bring a new level of sophistication to architectural imagery. His buildings reflected the great imperial British age in which he lived and raised the level of building technology and craftsmanship. Among his dozens of buildings were courthouses, banks, hotels, private residences, railway stations, schools, office buildings, the CPR steamship terminals, and many libraries. Rattenbury's work on Victoria's Parliament buildings had instantly established his reputation as the province's foremost architect of civic and institutional buildings. He received commissions for projects outside of Victoria, in Vancouver, the interior BC, and in Alberta. He was contacted by the Canadian Pacific Railways to help with additions to the Hotel Vancouver, a commission that made Rattenbury CPR's man in Western Canada. In 1901, he earned over $100,000 in commissions, worth millions now. Rattenbury was as active as ever, attacking his work with gusto, always looking for more. With capital in the bank and once again brimming with confidence, Rattenbury was ready for another adventure in free enterprise. He also designed private homes for the affluent in Oak Bay and throughout the city of Victoria. In 1907, he became one of the 4 first councillors in Oak Bay, which had been incorporated as a municipality in 1906. With his travels to England and Europe, he had become aware of the importance of urban planning and the need for parks and green spaces, so he immediately implemented the concepts of municipally controlled growth and the creation of parks and green spaces in British Columbia. He had been discouraged to see Victoria's unregulated growth, as he had envisioned tourism, not industry, as being the foundation of the city's economic future. Unable to effect change with private clients, he focused on the municipal level. Having built the Parliament building and the Bank of Montreal building, another cherry ripe for picking dropped into his lap: the CPR building, the Canadian Pacific Railway Steamship Terminal. This imposing structure is testament to the past importance of Victoria's inner harbour as the gateway to the city and Vancouver Island. The original terminal, only 20 years old at the time, was torn down in 1924 to make room for this imposing structure. Built in a neoclassical architectural style with Beaux-Arts influence, the massive Ionic columns on the north and south facades of the building accent its status as one of the inner harbour's most visible and significant buildings. The design is intended to playfully reflect a temple of Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, whose likeness adorns the exterior. Nowadays, the building is a wax museum. With his position soundly secured with the Canadian Pacific Railway, he was granted another contract to construct the one hotel that would change his life forever. On February the 19th, 1903, the announcement was made to build Victoria's famous landmark. It would sit majestically at the head of Victoria's inner harbour on the mudflats of James Bay, and would boast all the modern conveniences. The Empress Hotel was to be born. The Empress, named after Queen Victoria herself, is a French chateau-style building designed and constructed for Canadian Pacific to serve as a terminus hotel for the CP steamship line. The Empress officially opened on January the 21st, 1908. The Empress was initially designed for the benefit of wealthy tourists, but was embraced by all, residents of Victoria as well as tourists arriving on the steamships. Within a few days of its opening, the Empress established a businessman's lunch and arranged a small orchestra to entertain ladies for afternoon tea, a tradition still followed today. The chateau-style Empress still exudes a subdued elegance and opulence. Clothed with glorious green ivy, this photogenic grand old lady offers 100-years-old traditions, high tea rituals, tall, cool drinks in the Bengal room, magnificent dinners, and a stroll through the enclosed gardens of the atria and the rose gardens. For many years, the hotel did not have a sign out front. As workers raised the sign above the front entrance, the strong emotions that the hotel evoked in Victorians is exemplified in this statement made by one irate gentleman. "Why do they need a sign? Anyone who doesn't know this is the Empress Hotel doesn't deserve to be staying here anyway." Great public acclaim followed the construction of the Empress Hotel, and, at the time, the Canadian Pacific Company commissioned a framed picture of him, which sadly now hangs in an obscure corner of the basement level of the Empress Hotel near the elevators. This is probably a reflection of the distaste that the residents of Victoria had towards him because of his maltreatment of Florence during the later years of their marriage. It is a sad memorial to one of Canada's public figures and the most sought-after architect of his time. The years of the First World War were a bad time for Rattenbury, marking the beginning of the end for both his personal and financial worlds. Demands for his style of architecture disappeared, and his Grand Trunk Railway investments declined. This, combined with a miserable home life, was turning him to drink. He had never been abstemious, but his previous drinking had been merely social. Now he would consume a bottle of scotch every night. alone. Much of the time he was hungover and depressed. His renovations of the legislature kept him financially afloat, but otherwise he was in a bad way. Then, by the time the economy started to recover, Rattenbury lacked any desire to resume his career. With the war over, the temporary recession passed, and women more liberated, although not yet officially classified as people were very jolly, and the city of Victoria was ready for the building of the $200,000 Crystal Gardens Amusement Centre. This was Victoria's first convention centre. It was an arboretum, a restaurant, and an art gallery, as well as a swimming pool, and it saved Rattenbury. Not only did it give his career a refreshing jolt, but it introduced him to someone that would change his life forever. In 1925, a celebration was held at the Empress Hotel to recognise the opening of Crystal Gardens Centre, and Rattenbury was the focus of attention. On that evening, he felt rejuvenated and, with success on his mind, he met Alma Pakenham. Alma was in Victoria to give a concert. A fine pianist, she had just finished a recital at the Empress. In the distance, she heard loud choruses of "For he's a jolly good fellow," and so on. Curious to find out more, she wandered in the direction of the sound. There she saw the man of the hour being celebrated with a dinner. A mutual friend who was there introduced them, and their friendship began. Alma Pakenham, née Clark, was born in Kamloops in British Columbia in 1895. A lively, vivacious child, she showed great musical ability early on. She was so gifted that at age 18 she played 2 different concertos with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. She was also a composer of songs. In 1914 she married Caledon Dolling, who was killed 2 years later at the Battle of the Somme. She herself served as a war nurse with great distinction. After the war, she married Thomas Pakenham of the Irish aristocratic Longford family. A son, Christopher, was born, but the marriage ended disastrously. She moved to Vancouver, resumed her concert career, and later moved to Victoria. The relationship between Alma and Rattenbury quickly developed. Alma was quoted as saying to him, "Do you know that you have a lovely face?" That was a bit of a stretch, but Alma was everything that Florrie was not. She had deep, hauntingly sad eyes and full lips, was fashionable and sensuous. She was adventurous and fun-loving. He was bewitched, besotted, and conquered. She would be the cause of Francis Rattenbury's final downfall. Both were starved for passion, especially Rattenbury. He was not interested in being discreet, and Alma was never one to hide her feelings. Soon they were the talk of Victoria. The two of them began an affair that shocked the Victoria upper crust, among whom Rattenbury moved. What he was not prepared for was to be socially ostracized. His behavior was so outrageous that respect for him had vanished. He had never been well liked, but always well respected. Now that disappeared too. Alma was not prepared for this. Growing up a musical prodigy, she had always been feted and her faults overlooked. Now she was seen as a bewitching temptress, a disruptor of family life. In addition, she was accused of taking drugs and introducing Rattenbury to them. Alma, whose first husband had been killed in action in the First World War, had remarried and then divorced, and that made the scandal even more thrillingly offensive. Many were angry at the way Florence was being treated. Rattenbury wanted a divorce and was determined to get it. When Florence refused, he repeatedly harassed her. In an acrimonious split from his wife, he moved furniture out of their house and cut the power. When that failed to get a divorce, he began entertaining Alma in their home, forcing Florence upstairs. He then moved Alma into his house, living with her on the second floor while Florrie lived upstairs. Eventually he got his way, or so he thought. In 1925, his wife divorced him, but his public flaunting of his affair caused most of his clients and associates to shun him. Rattenbury and Alma, with 30 years difference in their ages, married and had a son, but they were never accepted. Rattenbury did not get a single contract ever again in British Columbia, and he was made a virtual outcast and pariah among the powerful provincial elite who had for 25 years hailed him as a giant of architectural excellence. In 1929, Florence Rattenbury, after suffering financial hardship after her divorce, died of a heart attack, and Florence's children would never have anything to do with their father. The bitterness remained. The same year that Florence died, Rattenbury and Alma's son John was born. Eventually, the hostility of Victoria's society and a drying up of commissions drove the erring couple from the city. In December, Rattenbury and Alma, with their son John and his young half-brother, set sail for England. They rented a house, Villa Madeira, in Bournemouth, a genteel seaside resort town on the south coast, 60 miles from London. With its population of ex-colonials and retirees, it had a stuffed shirt atmosphere much like Victoria. The choice was undoubtedly Rattenbury's, for Alma was not yet 40 and still had career hopes. She would have preferred the bustling life of London. But she was always agreeable and willing to go along with his wishes. Rattenbury tried and failed to get architectural commissions. He was no longer the man of his heyday. Ill health, advancing age, and alcoholism were beginning to take their toll on him physically and mentally. He became increasingly irritable and began to ignore Alma altogether, causing her great sadness and loneliness. Getting along with Rattenbury was getting harder and harder. He did not realize how dependent he was on personal status and prestige. Plus, he also needed the excitement of challenging work. Bournemouth had none. In Bournemouth, he was just one of many ex-colonials. Nobody knew of his career in Victoria, and nobody cared. No one wanted him as an architect, and, what's worse, he needed the money. They could just afford a part-time maid. Then, Alma's music career began to blossom again, with recordings and performances, and Rattenbury became increasingly disconsolate. In consequence, he sank into alcoholism and depression. Then, in 1934, an ad was placed into the local paper that would change their lives forever. The Rattenburys were looking to hire a young man to do light housework, yard work, and some chauffeuring duties, such as driving their son to school. George Percy Stoner answered the ad and was hired, being just 17 when he went to work for the Rattenburys. He seemed to fit the job perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. Alma became revitalized, but Rattenbury drank more. By 1934, Rattenbury, then aged 67, became a shadow of the man he once was. Along with alcoholism and depression came impotence, not a development to inspire a popular young woman 30 years his junior. He was becoming an old man while his wife was still young and beautiful. He talked almost daily about killing himself. Not surprisingly, the presence of a virile young man was too much. Alma succumbed to temptation and seduced the chauffeur, the 18-year-old George Stoner, and arranged for him to move into the house. Stoner was sexually naive and, by reported accounts, not too bright, with little experience with the world. Alma, by contrast, had been married 3 times and was old enough to be his mother. Emotions were welling up in Stoner that surprised even Alma. He became jealous of her husband and could not cope with a love triangle. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Alma precipitated events by taking Stoner to London for an intimate weekend alone and lavished expensive gifts on him. But when they got back, he became the servant again. When Alma and her husband decided they would go on an overnight trip together, it drove Stoner wild. He assumed that Alma would sleep with Rattenbury again, and his imagination ran amok. Alma denied that anything happened, but it was no good. Stoner had hit the breaking point, and in his confused state of mind and naivety, he became intensely jealous. So, on a fateful evening, March the 24th, 1935, while Rattenbury, aged 67, was in a drunken stupor, asleep in his chair in the living room, Stoner crept up behind him and struck him on the head 3 times with a croquet mallet and killed him. Exactly what happened next will never be known in full. What is known is that on that evening, Alma and Rattenbury played a game of cards. Alma excused herself at 9:30 p.m. to go and pack. A little later she went to bed, and Stoner joined her. At about 10:30, they said that they'd heard a loud groan from downstairs. Alma rushed down to discover Rattenbury covered in blood. He had obviously been hit hard with some implement. Alma's maidservant Irene came out and immediately phoned for a doctor. 2 doctors came, but it was too late for Rattenbury. They could see that it was a deliberate assault, and the police were called. The police came and questioned everyone, particularly Alma. After many wild and contradictory statements, fueled more and more by alcohol, Alma confessed that she had done it. She was arrested for murder, but later Stoner admitted to Irene that he had done it. The police, acting on Irene's information, arrested Stoner. Both he and Alma were charged with murder. The whole of Bournemouth, and later of Britain, became a frenzy of titivating gossip and rumour. The sensational murder trial at the Old Bailey in London dominated the tabloids and became a national scandal. The story had a huge following with mixed sympathies. Who really did it? The public lined up for hours to get a seat in the court, and the press had a field day. The main feature was Alma's testimony, as she had recanted her confession and pleaded not guilty. Despite intense questioning, she could not be discredited. In a low, rich voice, she handled all her questions well and emerged as believably innocent. Her testimony, though she did not intend it, put the blame on Stoner. As Stoner did not testify, the direction of the case was clear. Although Alma was chastised for being a nasty adulteress, she was acquitted. Stoner was sentenced to death by hanging. The writer James Agate covered the May to June 1935 trial. Here's a portion of his account. Wednesday the 29th of May. The Daily Express asked me to do an impression of the Rattenbury trial at the Old Bailey. The facts were very simple and hardly disputed. Mrs. Rattenbury, aged 38, wife of an architect, aged 67, had been the mistress of her 18-year-old chauffeur named Stoner. Somebody had hit the husband over the head with a mallet, both of them having, at one time or another, taken the blame on themselves. Agate also wrote, "It was all very like the 3 major French novelists. The way in which the woman debauched the boy so that he slept with her every night with her 6-year-old son in the room, and the husband, who had his own bedroom, remaining cynically indifferent. All this was pure Balzac. In the box, Mrs. Rattenbury looked and talked exactly as I have always imagined Emma Bovary looked and talked. Pure Flaubert. And last, there was that part of her evidence in which she described how, trying to bring her husband round, she first accidentally trod on his false teeth, and then tried to put them back into his mouth so that he could speak to her. This was pure Émile Zola. The sordidness of the whole thing was relieved by one thing and one thing only. This was when counsel asked Mrs. Rattenbury what her first thought had been when her lover got into bed that night, and told her what he had done. She replied, "My first thought was to protect him." This is the kind of thing which Balzac would have called sublime, and it is odd that, so far as I can see, not a single newspaper reported it. Alma was distraught at George Stoner's conviction. She was put in a nursing home and talked incessantly of Stoner. She frequently mentioned suicide, but after a few days she improved dramatically, and then one night she had an unknown visitor. It was a woman who stayed several hours before leaving. She insisted that Alma come with her, despite protests from the nurse. Alma did go then, but returned later alone. What was this meeting about? We will never know for sure, but it seems that Alma got little consolation from her visitor, as the woman had emphasized that Alma could not save Stoner from hanging. The trial totally destroyed Alma's reputation, such as it was. So acquittal meant only that she would live permanently in disgrace. Furthermore, she expected her young lover, George, to be executed. The next day, Alma borrowed £2 from a nurse, and with it she bought a knife. Later that night, Alma was seen on the Avon riverbank near Bournemouth. She was seen swinging her arms wildly about and then fell into the river. When they retrieved her, they could see that Alma had stabbed herself to death before falling into the river. How Shakespearean! Within days, the London newspapers had another sensational heading for their placards: "Mrs. Rattenbury stabbed and drowned." One Londoner was heard to say that it was the most dramatic news since the sinking of the Titanic. British society at the time was much more likely to be sympathetic towards a male rather than a female accused person, despite motives or other reasons. It seemed that most people sympathized with George Stoner rather than Alma. The possible goading of Alma into suicide by her mystery visitor had the desired effect. Reprieving Stoner had been impossible with Alma still around. The thought of them together again, even after many years in prison, was intolerable to the public. She was seen as an evil seductress who had led him astray. But with her gone, something could be done. A campaign was launched, and soon there was mounting public pressure to commute his sentence. A petition stated, "He was subjected to undue influence," the undue influence, of course, meaning Alma's sexual power. "He might have been the son of any of us," they all said. The Home Secretary, the government minister responsible, was presented with a huge petition signed by 350,000 people. He deferred all comment until legal appeals had run their course. Then he made the announcement: Stoner's sentence would be commuted to penal servitude for life. After serving 7 years in prison, Stoner was released in 1942 to join the army and took part in the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. He survived the war, married, and settled down to a quiet life. He died in the year 2000, less than a mile away from where Alma had died. No other architect has ever done more for a city than Francis Rattenbury had done for Victoria. He designed all the great buildings that dominate Victoria's inner harbour and beyond. First, he designed its signature buildings. Then he provided the raciest scandal of the 1920s by leaving his wife for a younger woman. Finally, he took his new wife to England, where he became the victim of the most celebrated British homicide of the 1930s. Today, both his buildings and his murder are part of the historical fabric of Victoria. Remembered for his colourful lifestyle, tumultuous life and tragic death, he was buried in an unmarked grave in the Wimborne Road Cemetery, close to his home in Bournemouth. The love triangle tragedy was one of the greatest scandals of the time and became dubbed the murder at the Villa Madeira, leading to the trial of the century, one of many, of course. If there was one thing about Rattenbury that most of his contemporaries could completely agree upon, it is that he was a persistent self-promoter. His life was filled with almost every kind of sensationalism that would inspire filmmakers for years to come. He lied about his credentials, he had illicit sexual affairs, dizzying fame and wealth and recognition, then alcoholism and the fall from grace, and finally murder. For Francis Rattenbury, now 77 years after his death, a headstone has been erected as a lasting memorial to him, paid for by a family friend. His son John, who was 5 at the time of his murder, commented on this act of kindness. He was a very important architect and had an extremely successful career. I think it's a thoughtful gesture so long after his death. Rattenbury's and Alma's son John, after bouncing around from relative to relative in England, eventually went to Canada in his early teens and followed closely in Rattenbury's footsteps. He became a world-renowned architect after apprenticing under Frank Lloyd Wright.